As I mentioned in the opening, we're honored to have three of the most important and insightful transportation leaders in Southern California on this morning's panel, which is entitled Transportation and Transition, Los Angeles. And I'm looking, here's one of them. Excellent. And Salida? All right, and I want to acknowledge that LA Metro and the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies are sponsors of this session. So we're doing this a little different than a traditional session. There's no presentations, no slides, and each of our three distinguished panelists are seated here to my left in alphabetical order. Kome Ashise, who is the Executive Director of the Southern California Association of Governments, Salida Reynolds, who is the General Manager of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, and Stephanie Wiggins, who is the Chief Executive Officer at LA Metro. And among their many distinctions, each of our panelists oversees aspects of the region's transportation systems broadly, and our public transit systems in particular. So they have the context of thinking about how transit fits into those larger systems. So rather than asking each of them to give them a presentation, I'm going to pose some questions to each of our panelists and hopefully get a conversation started, and then over time, don't forget Slido, we can bring you all into this conversation. So let me start with Kome. As the leader of the region's metropolitan planning organization, what is your vision for the future of transportation in Southern California broadly? And what roles do you see for public transit in particular in the years ahead? In the previous session, we were having a debate about what those roles ought to be.
Well, good morning.
Oh. Can we have help with the mic?
There we go.
Okay.
Good morning. Thanks, Brian. It's good to be here. It's good to be anywhere anymore. And as you might notice, I dressed up for this because it's been a while. We've worn non-elastic band pants, like I tell people.
You didn't have to do that on our account.
I like the question, first of all, because it means I don't have to be tethered to any reality that we're all experiencing today. Because it's about a vision, right? So you're going to grant me the opportunity to be able to visualize what the future will be. And I, as an optimist, I feel like transit absolutely has to be part of our future. And in fact, in our planning, because I so believe in our regional planning, transit is the backbone of our system as we look 25 years out. Because as we grow, the need for capacity in our mobility systems cannot be on the freeway system. And we've basically designed our freeway systems and built it. Somebody referred to it as like building the church for Easter Sunday. And so we've built it to accommodate the commute traffic. And then the rest of the hours, freeways are basically open. And so it's not the most effective thing that we've done. And I speak really about this, having worked for Caltrans for 20-something years. And having been part of that process. So I own that. So as we look into the future, I think we have to imagine a future that has choice in mobility. I think most people will still have cars and drive. I don't think that's going away. I think Michael Monville talked about the way we've laid out our communities already calls on everybody to own a car and drive. That's not shifting as fast as we might want it to. The things that we're doing with housing today may have an opportunity to shift that over time and create some more compact communities that allows for the use of other modes like walking and biking and transit. So I see that future that includes choice, and one that also allows us to be readily accepting of pricing the system, especially the freeway system, such that it's now more of a utility that you use more efficiently, and the more the more everybody wants to use it, the higher the price. We already see that working on the express lane system, so it's not foreign to us. So pricing is part of that. But we also have to change some of the behaviors around driving, such as, we talked, somebody mentioned the 6 cities where transit is more ubiquitous. Part of that is it costs a lot to drive in those cities, and we don't see that in our environment in this region. And over time, I think as capacity continues to be constrained, it should probably cost more to drive and allow us to build out more choice. But transit as a choice has to be an element of our future, but also creating other mobility choices. We're seeing some diversity, even transit, how we provide transit services. I think we're seeing that change, and these two trend-setting women are doing that in their organizations, where they're looking at transit as not just one type of service. And quite frankly, just to close out, I think we have to think of transit as not just a social service, but as a public good that we provide. And until we get out of this hand-wringing about what the role of transit is, I think we don't really get honest about what we could do differently. We have the automobile so ingrained into our system that we don't even understand some of the things that we do sometimes. And I'll give you one quick example and be quiet. There is Article 19 in the California Constitution. How many of you are familiar with Article 19? Okay. So Article 19 supposes that you can only use gas tax resources at the state level for capital projects. So if you're a transit provider, you can only use gas tax monies that are now a little bit more flexible. You didn't used to be flexible. You could only be used on the freeways. You can now use those to buy buses and build fixed guideway systems, and you can't use it to operate. And one of the best things about transit is, one of the best elements of transit is the investment in operations actually has a higher multiplier effect in the economy, more so than capital investment. And so to be able to break that loose, where we've so wedded, and now you can use Article 19 funds, which is state gas tax monies. You can use it to build freeways. You can also use it to maintain and operate the freeways. But you can't do that on the transit side. And so that's just one example of how we're so locked into having the automobile be part of our system. So I feel like I have this sense of people coming back to transit. We finally at SCAG came back to work, and on Tuesdays, we have about half of our staff show up to work. So I have this sense that even though we're going to be in a hybrid situation from here out, many people are still going to come back to work over time. And there will be a need to use transit, because most of our staff, actually, the majority of them use transit. And right now, they're driving because it's cheap to park downtown LA.
Thanks. And I want to come back to both the issue of transit as a public good and this issue of sort of managing automobiles in a minute. But first, I want to pick up on something that was tossed around in the previous session, and that was this idea that the pandemic has changed the idea of work locations and communities, commuting for many workers, but not all workers, in ways that were unimaginable 3 years ago. And so what we heard was, I think, and if I can paraphrase, a debate about an expectation among those who have been able to work remotely of expecting to continue to do that in a hybrid mode. And the Deborah reported among transit users that appeared to be even higher, I'd suspect because of those that commute into central city areas where there's a lot of office work. And the second was that from Jerry is that, well, the office market looked robust, and that we might expect that firms there might be more firms in a building that are each renting less space. There might be a different way that we think about offices, sharing offices, private office use, that we might end up having dense populations of many more people than in the past who were coming in 5 days a week. Well, those are two sort of things that seemingly at odds but aren't necessarily in conflict. It could be that people come in less, but there might be more people in those central city areas. One point suggests sobering news for public transit serving big job centers. The other one points to some potential optimism. As you think about the way you configure services, and I'm thinking more of Stephanie and Salita here in terms of serving these big job centers, what do you anticipate in terms of what the demand for these services will be? Are you all projecting that you see a return to significant transit trips in and out of major job centers, downtown LA, of course, and then other big job centers? Or do you take the more cautious view that transit patterns may be very different moving forward? And if so, what does that mean for your service planning and capital planning?
You want me to go? Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Brian, for the question. I don't think that we are radically going to be changing our assumptions and forecasts based upon, the role of remote work. We do believe it's here to stay, but we weren't capturing enough of the mode share pre-pandemic, right? And so it just requires us to, one, be very clear about the principles of mobility and making sure that we are providing a service that gets people where they want to go. I mean, prior to the pandemic, our operations department had worked 3 years with community on NextGen, how we were going to restructure our bus network. And foundational to that was really making sure we had a system that spoke to more where people needed to go. And I think as long as we carry that forward, even coming out of the pandemic, it will bode well for us. We just got back from DC a couple of weeks ago. Our federal partners still understand the need for mobility, the forecast to help address climate change initiatives, health equity initiatives. And we know that major job centers are a key part of that. So I don't see it fundamentally changing in terms of being a foundational way. We look at forecasting where the demand will be, but we are more intentional about making sure we understand where people need to go.
Yeah, I would just say plus 100. And I think the pandemic freed us from a couple of biases that were always underpinning the way that we provided transit service in this country. The first one is that, some of the architects of that service were mostly trying to serve white-collar 9-to-5 workers. They were trying to bring people out from the suburbs into these downtown job centers, and we can have a whole conversation about redlining and why that was, and really dig into it. But the second challenge, maybe it's not so much a bias, is that a lot of federal funding that you could access, you had to demonstrate how it was going to improve air quality or reduce congestion during the peak periods. So it drove transit agencies and other public agencies to amplify service during those very traditional bookend peaks, which haven't existed in Los Angeles, as far as I can tell, for at least 10 or 15 years. And what was always true, and anybody who studied transportation could tell you this, is that the majority of trips that people make throughout the day are not their commute trips. And I think the pandemic allowed us to kind of freed us from that a bit, which was always true. And I think Metro's NextGen work was really, it predated the pandemic. It acknowledged that there was a huge swath of trips, mostly made by women and people of color and students and a whole bunch of folks that were getting left out of that hyper-focus on the commute trip. The DASH system has always been a neighborhood-serving system. The LA DOT transit system has always sort of served those other trips. And so we didn't see as much of a dip And we were able to observe a sort of a shift in ridership in real time. And I don't think I hope we don't go back to trying to focus on those job centers, because it hasn't been grounded in reality for a while. And I will say, I was up in San Francisco a couple of months ago, and the other thing that's nice about Los Angeles is that it's never had one dominant center. It's always been a city of multiple centers. But a place like San Francisco, that transit service to the financial district has been utterly decimated, and it's not clear that it will come back. And worse than that, those riders provided much of the financial foundation for the muni system broadly. And so I think the other thing that the pandemic has revealed is that leaning too heavily on fare box recovery, the systems that suffered the most were the ones that were the models of fare box recovery prior to the pandemic, and that the systems that have been more resilient are those that relied on different financial models.
Let me pick up on that comment and an earlier one by Kome about transit as a public good, and this came up in our prep call that we had. The idea that the pandemic has sort of changed or challenged our views about what transit is and what it does, and indeed the first session had a lot of a discussion of what those roles might be. And so I guess this would go more toward Stephanie and Salita, but do you think that there has been a change in perspective in terms of what the role for transit is and what should it play? And if we view transit as some sort of a public good, how we ought to think about transit performance? Because that certainly started to come up at the end of the last session as well.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about, if I have to see another article on cost per rider, without the counterbalance of return per rider, when we talk about public transit, and that idea that the return on that investment has value to those individuals, to their families, to their communities. When we did our work on gender equity, changing lanes, we asked women, what are the trips that you are not taking? And the answers we got back were things like, I can't get to church every Sunday, so some Sundays I don't get to be in fellowship with my community. My son lives too far away, so I can only see them, once a month or once a quarter or once every 6 months because it takes so long to get there. How do we value the service we provide in giving people really respect, sovereignty, dignity in their lives? And then furthermore, how do we measure, if somebody has a reliable way to get to their job every single day, it's not just about them getting and keeping a job, it's about them keeping their place in line for promotion. It's about economic mobility. And specifically, it's about growing the pie for everybody in the region. When we can provide for folks who are missing out on those things right now, we all benefit because the economy is stronger, the city is stronger, the community is stronger, we're more resilient to shocks like the one we experienced during the pandemic and that we're going to keep on experiencing because of climate change. But we don't have a way of talking about that allows me as a public official to say, listen, the return on investment for this transit-only lane or for this mobility wallet pilot is X for everybody. The only metrics I have are ridership, cost per rider, travel time, how much time did I save people. Those things aren't compelling and they aren't meaningful. So, I really hope that as we sort of try and advance an idea called universal basic mobility, and we try and move that pilot forward that we have funding for in South LA, that we can really, there's a call to action for the research community to come in and to assist us, not for free, but hopefully some of you might be inspired to do it and bring it into your own work. Because that's the magic and the power of communities like the ones in this room, is practitioners and researchers that can begin to allow us to shift the whole conversation about the value of transit.
Stephanie?
And I would just add that definitely the pandemic has stirred the conversation. We're talking about it openly. My concern is that it's more of a trend or a fad, and it's not going to be real. Because when it's real, it's in the policy. And
Budget.
it's in the budget, and more importantly, it's in the grant requirements on how you're going to be evaluated for funding at the federal and state level, and none of those things have changed. So I would add to Salita's call to action for this group, since you have a powerful voice as academic, the academic community is really to help educate the policymakers at the state and federal level, the ones who write the grant requirements, because this will all be temporary and be fleeting, I fear, once the pandemic turns officially endemic, and we will not get sustainable change until we can stop talking about pilots and be talking about permanence.
Great, thanks. I want to actually pick up on a comment that that Salita made and actually put it back to Stephanie here. Well, actually to all of you, which was this idea of, there's ways that the funding works that sort of compels us to think about peak hour commuting. And we've had this discussion earlier today. Do you all see a tension between serving the most mobility disadvantaged travelers and attracting current drivers onto buses and trains, or do you think that these can be made compatible? Can you flesh that out a little bit? Is that a false dichotomy between the two, or do you see that serving the needs of those who are mobility disadvantaged is congruent with serving the needs of or attracting people out of cars and into public transit?
Yeah, I'm totally in favor of, I think her name was Deborah on the previous panel. That's my vision. It should not be that we're only providing service for the transit dependent, or that somehow a transit dependent person has a different level of standard and expectations of quality and service than someone who has a choice. That's not my experience. We need to provide service that is clean, fast, safe, gets people to where they want to go, regardless of their economic situation. So I don't see the tension there.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we have to acknowledge, and choice rider is another term that I hope I never hear again. We could just give that a funeral, pour out a little liquor for it, bury it, and move on. I think we have to acknowledge that there are inherent inequities in people's access to mobility right now. And until we even that playing field, and by the way, that includes overtly acknowledging the role of the car in evening, leveling that playing field, and taking a more expansive view of public transit as a public good, that Stephanie's not going to be able to do it all by herself. Other public agencies, other services have to be in place at the same time. And until we sort of right that wrong and acknowledge and accept it, I don't think we have any business talking about how can we make it better for people who already got it good. When I talk about universal basic mobility, anybody who is, and this was borne out in the gender equity study, white women who are closer to middle income on the West Side, they can overcome a lot of the inequities that women in Watts and women in the San Fernando Valley cannot, because they have access to so many more choices in how they get around right now. There was a 20% gender gap in driver's licenses in Watts between men and women, a 50% gap in access to smartphones. How can we talk about making investments for people who already have so many choices until we take a hard look about whether or not we've even been serving the people equitably from the beginning? I think that's kind of the challenge, and I also think it is a myth that somehow low-income folks care less about on-time performance or affordable service or a clean and safe, environment, no matter how they travel, that somehow those things don't matter to them, but they matter to wealthier riders or commuters, and that and that's, I think, something that we have to just really repudiate and push back on pretty firmly until we're not talking about it anymore.
Let me just do a quick follow-up, and you can elaborate on that, Stephanie, and then I'm going to come back to another question for Kome, and that is, can you give some examples of things that coming out of that sort of research that you were doing on the trans experience for women and girls and or people who identify as female, and as well as for the racial ethnic consequences of that? Are there things that you've been able to follow up on? You were talking about some of the things that you're trying to implement coming out of that. Is there, and as well for Stephanie, because certainly perceptions of safety vary enormously by race, ethnicity on public transit. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about any work you're doing in that regard.
Sure, and here I want to acknowledge that it was a limited study that we self-funded, right? So it certainly it wasn't as inclusive of, people who don't identify, who are non-binary, who don't identify as women or men. We weren't able to get there. It was also community research, so we funded participation, and so we used big data and human-specific data together, but it is only a beginning, and there is not enough of a body of research yet. Some of the great work that is coming out of UCLA was really helpful, but there's more to do. So I think that's another exciting area that we could all be thinking about, because some of the things that we found, again, that women want are the same things that everybody wants. As an example, if you are on an LADOT transit bus and a few of the lines in those areas and it's dark out and you want that transit operator to let you out before your stop because it's closer to your destination, we're piloting that. We're trying that out because that's something that we heard that women like because it makes them, perhaps they have issues around personal safety. But that's good for anybody who has an armful of groceries or anybody who has mobility issues or just anybody who doesn't want to, walk the extra 2 blocks and wants to just get home faster to be with the people that they love. So, that is an initial step. And the second step is just about how we collect data and how we get information back about it broadly. What we discovered is that approach of sort of taking data and aggregating it was painting a really disingenuous picture of what was going on, that actually investing in those focus groups and acknowledging that when we ask people to give us information, they're doing emotional labor, particularly in communities where government is not trusted and government is the perpetuator of harm. Actually paying those folks to come and talk to us gave us so much more insight and information, and that is something that we're now trying to bring into all of the project evaluations that we do, just a totally different approach to collecting that kind of data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add, for us, I think what was transformative, as Salita said, we were collecting the data all along. We just weren't analyzing the data. So the real power in disaggregating the data to really tell the story that women, at least how they experienced our system, particularly as it related to safety, women on their number one issue barrier, whether they were riding our system, stopped riding our system, or never rode our system. Their number one rated barrier was safety, right? And we did not have that ranking for men who filled out the survey. And so some of the things we implemented really helped us better understand what safety means from a gender perspective. And we implemented more real-time information on bus arrivals because waiting was a real concern for women. We also saw that during the day, women felt more safer on our system, 65%. At night, 20% said they felt safe. So the importance of lighting, it really helps inform, particularly when you have limited resources, where you should best invest on those issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I now want to circle back to one other thing that came up in the discussion, and this was the idea of as soon as trips don't end in a government-mandated free parking space, all of a sudden transit use starts going way up. And we can see that in cities around the country, that as soon as there isn't lots of road capacity and lots of places to park one's car, the role of transit and walking and travel by the means all can blossom. And in a place like Los Angeles, that I first got to know Stephanie when she was working on some some experiments with trying to manage automobile travel, and I know that this is something that SCAG and COME have been working on a long time. We had this conversation in the opening session about the role of managing private vehicle travel and what it might mean for a renaissance for public transit, and that we frequently dance up to the edge of almost doing something or trying a pilot and then backing off a little bit. And I'm wondering about looking at the long term, the amount of vehicle growth in ownership and travel is continuing to go up, and there's just limitations of a region of nearly 19 million people in accommodating all that automobile travel, the environmental problems associated with that. What do you see as the prospect for meaningfully managing private vehicle travel in the years ahead, and what that might mean for the role of public transit? And of course, Lita can jump in too, but I know that both Stephanie and COME have spent quite a bit of time on this issue.
Well, I think that's a great question. It's something societally, I mean, we've collectively, we've sort of danced around it. We've understood that we can't continue to expand the system to beat congestion. And we've come to terms with the fact that pricing the system makes sense, such that there's a premium for use at certain times, and then condition people to not use it. But that pricing is not just to price the freeway system and the use of it, but price the use of the automobile in general. Now, I should just stipulate up front that this is not about transit versus cars. You're entitled to own a car. In fact, you're welcome to own a car if that's what you want to do. But you should also be able to have the choice of not having to drive the car all the time. And so that's where we have to be very intentional about investment in alternatives to the car. And it's going to vary from, Los Angeles is a big area, and when you look at the SCAG region, it's even a much bigger area to contemplate. I mean, bigger than about 45 states in terms of population that we have in the SCAG region. We've always maintained that the region is really polycentric, even within LA. I think Salita alluded to that. It's polycentric. There's no just one absolute center like you'd have in the Bay Area. So understanding that, the types of choices that's available to people for mobility, different from having to drive their car, may vary from place to place. And we have to be thinking about that very clearly, that you will not be able to run the transit system, the dash system that I use very often in downtown LA. You might not be able to run those in other parts of the region, like in Inland Empire and such. But there is something that you can adapt to where people don't have to drive in some of those centers in the inland region that may be useful. So thinking of transit, looking at the next gen process, the microtransit systems, the use of mobility, thinking of mobility as a service and how those can complement the choice that we're talking about, such that we're not driving. I think it's important. But overarching all of that, though, is to make sure that there's incentives in making those choices. And that might be a disincentive to driving alone, because there's in fact established data that there is a societal disbenefit from everybody wanting to drive. We just can't afford it. And if we can't afford it, then we should incentivize people to make the choice differently. But to begin to make that choice, you have to also invest in those choices. Being able to go from home to the grocery store to get a gallon of milk, and you have to get in your SUV to do that. It seems ludicrous, but we do that because most of our communities don't have the infrastructure to feel safe walking or biking, those 30-minute walk or 15-minute walk that it might take. And so we have to think very seriously about making those choices real by investing in different mobility choices that are available to us. We've seen, though, that in coming back from the pandemic, we've seen growth already on the highway system in terms of vehicle miles traveled. It's basically returned back to almost pre-pandemic times. The variability is different a little bit. It's not the pre-pandemic heavy peak periods. It's all day now for the most part because people are making those trips all day. Being able to meet people where they are in terms of providing choice for transit and other mobility choices to meet those needs that people are feeling they have to drive for, I think is important. We're seeing the non-commute trips growing faster than the commute trips in the return from the pandemic. So I think there's a lot of data in front of us that we need to really spend some time looking at so that we can then refocus our investment in the choices that should be available such that we can then disincentivize people from having to drive alone.
Stephanie?
I would say I'm feeling nostalgic, Brian. Remember Wall Street and Gordon Gekko says greed is good? I'm going to say pricing is good. Actually, November of this year will be the 10-year anniversary of the express lanes. 10-year anniversary of the express lanes. Over 1 million LA County residents have a transponder account with us. They understand pricing. They understand the benefits. Over 100 million of the net toll revenues has been reinvested in active transportation, bus procurement. It funded Foothill Transit's first zero-emission bus pilot order, bus operations and service. And it was good for the environment. It's been good for the environment. We had average travel speeds below 45 miles per hour, which we know that's when you have more pollution being emitted during gridlock. And these have been free-flowing lanes. So not to mention ridership on our bus routes that operate on those lanes has increased as a result of pricing those lanes. So as we talk about what's our long-term vision, our innovation office has already begun a couple of years ago where we're in the midst of a traffic relief study that really looks at expanding pricing, because I do think that is the key ultimate tool. Number one, we've even seen with our express lanes during the pandemic that it's resilient. We're almost back to pre-pandemic levels on the express lanes. But I think the ideas that we're looking at with our traffic relief study, cordon pricing, and others is really the future. And I'm happy to elevate the express lanes on the 10 and the 110. The 10 will be 10 years next February, because it really shows that a lot of concerns people had about equity and, quite frankly, Armageddon as a result of car-obsessed LA County pricing itself, they really were not manifest. And so when we think about, if we're really concerned about addressing the urgency of the day with climate, really having a sustainable future, and really finally getting that significant mode shift, pricing is our future.
And as we talk about pricing, everybody seems to think, the freeway system. We're actually talking about pricing to the level of looking at parking, what the parking rates are, and that's a strong element in terms of incentive. We're also looking at just cordon pricing along the boulevards that are heavily traffic that have heavy traffic on it, that could have bus lines that can replace those trip making opportunities. We also see, in terms of being able to connect folks to the transit system. The Metrolink system is one of our biggest assets in this region. I think you would say that, right? It's one of our biggest assets in the region that I think we are not paying enough attention to because it can provide that alternative to a lot of our long-haul trips on the system in terms of commuting. But it's not just looking at it to match commute patterns, the commute peak periods, but to also look at service midday to provide access for people. And then finally, when you look at the other options that are available with mobility as a service, we've had experiments across our region where some jurisdictions have been able to provide a geo-fenced area for lift rides to a transit stop. such that you now have a lift ride that can get you to the goal line, for example, and then you don't have that barrier of being able to get to the goal line, or having some low performing routes replaced by a lift ride or such, and still connect you to the system so that you can continue that mobility. But we have to always, as we think through all of this, which was done with the expressway system, you have to also think about how does this enhance equity, make sure that folks are not left behind because they don't have a phone, because they don't have a bank account. I have to give a shout out to the state on the Cal ITP process that's going on that would open up this access to mobility, such that you don't have to be unbanked. You don't have to be banked, I should say, to be able to then use the systems. Because if many of us here have phones and we have access to a Lyft ride because we have phones and we have credit cards and banks and such. But there are a big swath of folks that can't do that. They have to load up monies onto access cards that then keeps them locked in, whereas and then they're locked into just that one trip making opportunity. However, if we have the system that I think this Cal ITP process could bring around, as an example, you then have mobility available to all folks across all choices that are out there. So I think that's part of the way to make the incentive work, such that we're not married solely to the single occupant vehicle.
Okay, thanks. Now I have a bunch more questions, and I'm going to have to defer to the audience here. I'm enjoying this so much. I never get the time, the FaceTime with all three of you to ask all of these questions. This has been fabulous. And I hope that when Kome suggested pricing parking, someone got Donald Shoup's smelling salts, and that he's okay wherever he is over there. But let's take over. And Jacob, do you want to manage the Slido now?
Yeah. Again, Slido.com. Arrowhead is the keyword to put in there. First up, we have Eli, if you want to ask your first question about shelters, and then Alejandra after him.
Yeah. And Alejandra, you should probably queue up here. You can jump up to get ready for...
Hi, Eli Littman, Move LA. Hello all. Investing in Place estimates that only 25% of bus stops in the city of LA have shelter. With temperatures reaching record levels and low-income bus riders standing outside in unhealthy heat, we have a public health and a public health crisis. What can the MPO, DOT, and Metro do to deploy more shelter? And I would put out there that Move LA has written a bill, AB 1975, that we think that would not only fund more shelters from the state, so provide state funding specifically from the SHOP program for shelter as a critical infrastructure, but streamline the process by which shelters are sited in cities and counties. So, thank you.
Well, I think probably, the lion's share of that question falls to the city, at least in the city of Los Angeles, that, the street furniture contract, these are deep systemic issues. The way that we fund street furniture is by commercializing public space. It is not by thinking about how can we provide shade for people who need it the most in places where it exists the least, and then we proceed from there. And that shelter process is highly contentious and very political. I don't know how many years it's taken the Board of Public Works and the Public Works bureaus to try and shepherd through a process to select a new vendor. But the foundation is pretty weak and does not allow or enable, it necessarily drives shelters to places that are going to get the most impressions because it relies on advertising. And that means you're going to neighborhoods that have high numbers of people walking and moving around in wealthier neighborhoods. We're talking about the West Side, we're talking about Hollywood, we're talking about downtown, the Arts District, et cetera. And so until we can really dig down and fix that issue and come up with sustainable funding source for bus shelters that does not rely on ad revenue, number one, and does not include that as an incentive at all, and also puts it under the purview of an agency that is charged with mobility and not necessarily maintenance and revenue. Until we shift that, it is going to be really challenging to get different results.
I would just say how we're approaching it in the planning of new infrastructure projects like North San Fernando Valley BRT. As our team has gone out, listened to the public for feedback, they highlighted the importance of, as an amenity, having more shelter. And as a result, our operations and planning team have come up with a proposal that actually helps bring that amenity forward as part of that project planning that is different if we would have followed our normal process and our corridor only thinking of BRT planning. So it is something that we are more intentional about, and we continue to work with our city partners on what's the best way to address it. But as Salita shared, there are some institutional challenges.
I can offer maybe a slightly different impression about that. I think shelters are conditioned to your headways. So if you're going to be waiting for a bus for a while, yeah, you do need a shelter. So if we have invested in a system such that the headways are shorter, the shelter, given the environment we live in Southern California, we have great weather. It's not like we have torrential rainfall. I think with shorter headways, the shelter may not be as necessary. And I say that because you also want to have the flexibility of route planning such that, because right now you're married to this infrastructure that's stuck in one place and your route has to go by because you put some investment in it. Whereas if you're more agile and you didn't have shelters and you have more headways, shorter headways, then you don't have to be so wedded to that one location. But that's just one other perspective about this, because I think shelters are necessary where you have, especially in areas where you have headways that are a little longer and people are waiting in the sun.
Can I politely push back on my friend from the MPO?
Absolutely, ma'am.
I
Yes.
think this is where, institutionally, we keep unintendedly putting bus as an inferior good. We would never think on the rail system not to have shelter for people who are waiting for the rail system that has more frequencies. And I do agree that, yes, we need to have more investment in bus so we can operate more frequently. But, the basics of shade and an amenity and what it means to safety, it is interesting that the supposed higher modes or the more superior modes, they have the shelter and the shade as foundational.
Well, and we have a lot of infrastructure that can't accommodate large shelters, so we have to figure out other creative ways to provide that shade. And I think especially if you're, a parent traveling with small children, if you're an older adult, if you're somebody with disabilities, there's a whole host of people where it's going to be in the 90s here next week. It doesn't matter how long you're waiting. Every minute feels like an hour. And you would desperately need something to give you some relief and also to help you manage, whatever other things you are trying to manage without having to just focus entirely on the physical discomfort and maybe even, the medical panic that you might be experiencing no matter how long you're waiting for the bus. But there are so many sidewalks in the city of Los Angeles that are the bare minimum. They are 3.5 feet or 4 feet wide, and they won't accommodate these massive shelters that are built out to, again, feature prominently advertising. They are not there to provide relief for bus riders. They're there to create value for the companies that are funding them. And so that's another, that has stalled out, in my opinion, creativity around what we even think of as a shelter and how they function. So I think that's a piece for all of us to sort of, some context to think about too. I mean, when I take the bus and, able-bodied, and even when I'm by myself, I don't curse anybody in particular, nobody in this room, of course, but there is cursing that happens no matter how long I have to wait, especially if I just missed a bus.
I would just say,
I just want to
Go
make
ahead.
sure we get a couple more.
I'm sorry, go
questions
ahead.
and not-
All right.
and I love to talk about shelters. In fact, while Alejandra's getting up there, I mean, research shows that transit riders wait time, WEIGHT, WAIT time, at about 3 times the in-vehicle time. So what happens while they're waiting and transferring is really important to people's use of transit. So, but this is a great conversation, but I want to make sure we get some more in here. Yes.
Hi. So I'll just read off my question. Free transit was available in the earlier months of the pandemic, and it was very successful. What are some challenges in continuing to offer free rides besides challenges in state and federal funding policy?
besides state or federal funding, that is the challenge. It's $300 to $400 million a year, every year. So the trade-off for me as the CEO is, do I want to continue Fairless without having a substitute funding source, or am I going to reduce service to cover the $300 to $400 million a year? So what we have done is we've developed a staged approach to Fairless. We started with K through 14, the most vulnerable population in LA County. 70% of the students in LAUSD alone come from low-income households. Community college students report 25% report housing insecurity, food insecurity, and transportation insecurity. So we are in the midst of our Go Pass program, which is phase 1 of Fairless. Last week, we reached 1.5 million boardings through that program. We got 20% more students registered in that program than pre-COVID. And the beauty of that is we're getting data to show policymakers how this is transformative for people's lives. And we think that will be one of the things that will make us more effective and persuasive at the federal and state level, as well as local level, because there are people who think we should not be investing in this, to see why we need to have a different fund source to move away from Farebox. And I would say, to your question, not federal or state funding, the policies for capital grants to extend Sepulveda Transit are all dependent on Farebox recovery. Mm-hmm. The grants at the state level that we receive still say you must have Farebox. They do not do that on highway. So unless someone changes the policy, they're not serious about really making sure Fairless is something plausible and feasible and sustainable.
Okay. One more question, is it?
Yeah, I think Tamika's up next.
While Tamika's coming up, I just want to chime in on that because what I hear Stephanie saying is not that Fairless is not a good thing. It's just that we are stuck with a fair recovery because of the various policies, and there is in fact a cost to collecting the fares as well that you have to take into account. And if we're going to make this a public good, and we think of it as a public good, I think the baby steps that you see being taken are very necessary to define how Fairless can be a change in people's lives as they have access to unfeathered mobility.
Hi, good to see you all. My question was just, here in LA, we have some groups like No Olympics and other folks who are really pushing back on the Olympics for a variety of social justice reasons. But I think there's also a lot of transportation folks who are really excited about the Olympics because of the potential of investment in our systems. What do you all think are some of the promises of the games and some of the pitfalls of the games for transportation, or even broader than that? Easy question.
Okay,
Easy
cool.
question.
So here's the deal. We had a lot of extra time, to think about what we wanted for the 28 games. And my challenge, or, sort of desire, is that we very quickly articulate a strong vision, that LA 28 articulates a strong vision to answer your question about what do the people of Los Angeles get in exchange for being hosts for this world stage. Because the risk is that the innovation that we see arises directly from the companies that are able to sign sponsorship deals and contracts for exclusive service. And that, again, doesn't get us to delivery of the promise of having the world stage. When you say the words Olympics outside of Los Angeles, it's like a magic spell. People get real hypnotized and excited, and it opens up so many conversations and opportunities. But there isn't yet kind of a sort of a headline for what we are actually trying to accomplish. So, when we talk about it amongst the individual agencies, we're talking about, delivering on a promise of service to underserved communities, and delivering on a promise of access to young people, to recreation and sports who don't currently have it, so that we're creating the Olympians of the future. But the other challenge with the games is that this region promised to deliver them without asking for a whole bunch of new money. We said, we've got all the things that we need, and we're just going to do those things. And so that was a winning strategy to get the bid, but I don't know that it was a wise strategy to fully take advantage of what we could, the investment and the promise that we could bring. So I think that's kind of where we are right at this moment. We still have time. We still have extra time. And I think the folks on this stage and many others are sort of pushing hard to get us to that starting line so that we can answer that question with clarity.
Well, I think it's a good thing for the most part to have Olympics in your community, and for us in Southern California, I think it sort of is an opportunity to elevate a lot of our society. I think of all the games that we've seen in the recent past, the London Games come to mind, and how that was the difference in East London. That's more, it's got more minorities, more low income, and it was a major change. What was left behind was a major change for them. I think there's that opportunity to think of the Olympics that way, besides just the pixie dust and the glitter and all stuff that come with Olympics. We see the opportunity as we identify venues across the region. We see those as potential growth poles for elevating our various parts of our community, such that we can have a meaningful impact on reducing inequities as a result of the Olympics.
And a lot of those things were land use plays, right? You think about Falls Creek and Vancouver, and I think in this room we've all just sort of all assumed that we all get it, that land use has to move alongside, transportation changes. But I think there's that piece of it is has the potential to densify and create the conditions around which transit, EV car sharing, biking, walking can thrive. And that's an opportunity we don't want to miss by a lack of specificity either.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that we're going to wrap there because we need to end at noon in 90 seconds, and I can't imagine that we'll get a question and a fulsome response in that time. So I'd like you to join me in thanking our three panelists.